All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third and final PowerPoint in Unit 2, the third and final Schoology for Unit 2. This is kind of our cleanup one where we finish wrapping up the last little bit of static content we need to understand. This is going to be organizing the Constitution, amending the Constitution. What is the Constitution? Remember, we have two founding documents that we really think about in America, and many people confuse them. The first is the Declaration of Independence, and we covered that. The Declaration of Independence is really our philosophical document that lays out some ideals. Remember Thomas Jefferson's wonderful second paragraph of "we hold these truths to be self-evident." Well, that's philosophy. It doesn't structure. It doesn't tell us how. It's not process. The Constitution, on the other hand, is our social contract. The Constitution is that document that lays out what powers we will give up, what freedoms we will give up, and what protections we will get, and how this is going to work. If you think back to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and their idea that this is how governments are formed, social contracts. We give up rights, we gain protection. Well, we do that in the Constitution, and we want to make sure that it is binding. So think of this like the highest law of the land. This is our structure. Our Constitution has some principles because we have some principles that we want to think about for our government. The first is the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the people rule. When we looked at those different types of governments we had studied in comparative systems of government, we looked at this evolution of government from the natural state through dictators, the problems dictators have in monarchies, the problem monarchies have through totalitarian regimes, and then lastly, kind of this answer and this question of why democracy. It always comes back to the idea that we want the people to rule. And this creates up a dynamic of majority rule versus minority rights. What we mean is, once we get to 51%, that's the law. That's what we're going to decide, so long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of the minority. And when we say minority, I don't want you to just think African American, Latino, those kind of things. We mean any group that is the smaller half. In other words, once we're at 51%, the 49%, we still have to protect their rights. We also believe in a separation of powers. Think Montesquieu. This idea that we should divide power. If we believe and agree with Hobbes and Locke's assertion that all governments will abuse their power, then the number one thing we should try and do when we establish a government is try and restrict their ability to abuse it. And we do that by giving power to different people. The first thing that we have is federalism, this idea of a state government or local government and a national government. The Constitution expressly states that we will have a federalist system, but it does include the supremacy clause. That way, if we have some confusion about who's in charge, whether it's the state or federal level, we understand that the federal government will rule. And also that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. No law can violate the Constitution. We set up checks and balances whereby power is divided between our three branches of government. There are things that the president can do to stop things Congress does. We'll talk about that later. There are things Congress can do to stop what the Supreme Court does. And the Supreme Court can rule anything that either of the other branches does is unconstitutional. We believe in a limited government. Obviously, today's limited government is not Thomas Jefferson's limited government. Government has expanded rapidly compared to 1776. But again, that's based on our first thing, popular sovereignty. We expect more from our government. We want more from our government. And lastly, the rule of law. We believe that no one is above the law. Congress, the president, our military leaders, all have to follow the law. Think back to the Magna Carta, that first document in 1215 that states that everyone has to follow the law, even the king. The structure of our Constitution starts with the Preamble, and we discussed this in class this morning. There are 6 purposes of government, and we will talk more about how sometimes these 6 purposes run into each other. Sometimes while you're doing something to help one of the purposes, you will create conflict with another. And our first purpose is simply to unite the states. The idea that we are one unified country. We are one unified people, despite our differences. Number 2, to establish justice, to make sure that this is a country where it's not about who's strongest who wins. It's about who is right. Who's following the law? Who has justice on their side? 3, to maintain peace. When we look at foreign countries and we study other parts of the world, we could see, especially in the Middle East, this idea of constant fear, constant threats. People are afraid to go to the grocery store because of suicide bombers, because of attacks. We have military checkpoints to go from country to country. We want within our country peace. We want the number one thing that we demand from our country is this idea of protection. If we're going to give up our freedom, we have to get protection back. And so the idea is we should be able to walk down the streets of any city, any day, any time, and be able to feel safe. Number 4, to create a military to protect us from other countries. We can see this is one area that the United States excels. Number 5, to help people. And this is one that we'll talk about a lot as the year goes on because this gets kind of controversial. What we mean by that is, how much should we help? How should we help? How are we going to help? If we're helping, where do we get the money to help? And number 6, to protect freedom. To ensure that the things that we believe in today, these blessings of liberty, that they exist for our children and our children's children. After the preamble, we have Article 1 of the Constitution, and this deals with the legislative branch. Now remember, as you're crafting anything, you always deal with the things you think are most important first. And the legislative branch is the most powerful branch of government. The mistake many Americans make today is to think that the president is all powerful. The president does all of this stuff. If the economy is good, it's the president. If the laws are bad, it's the president. That's not true. Congress is designed to be the most powerful. They have the most members, 535 total. And we do that on purpose so that we can take care of making sure that government, again, deals with that separation of power, that instead of one person in charge, we have many. It's bicameral, so we have the House and the Senate. And we choose those members differently. In the Senate, we have equal representation. In the House, we have proportional. So in the Senate, every state has 2 senators. And in the House, a state like Rhode Island has very few members versus a populous state like California. This is a result of the Great Compromise. We list specific powers for the legislative branch. Article 2 then deals with the executive branch. There are very few powers listed in the executive branch. This is partially because our first president was George Washington, and they knew he was going to be the first president. And they trusted him to act accordingly, to limit, and set a precedent of the president not being a monarch, not being a king. We elect the president and vice president by an electoral college. We list that in Article 2, how to elect them, how to remove them, the process of impeachment. Impeachment is removing the president or vice president or any elected official. Article 3, lastly, then deals with the establishment of justice, this balance of a judicial branch. It lists that we're going to have a Supreme Court. But it says, and this is one of the brilliant geniuses of the Founding Fathers, is that they realized they didn't know everything. They expected the country to grow. They expected the country to change. And so it talks about how we can make other courts. And here we see again, Congress comes into play. Congress is another word for the legislative branch. Congress can decide how many courts we need. It does list specific powers of the federal courts as well. So we see there are powers listed for the legislative, there are powers listed for the judicial, but there aren't many powers listed for the president. What we assumed is George Washington would lay down this. Now, over time, we've seen the powers of the president grow, simply because Congress and the Supreme Court have deferred to the president. They've allowed the president to absorb more powers. But again, since it's not in the Constitution, we always have the question of we could simply have those powers removed if we felt the president was abusive. Now, Articles 4 through 7 deal with kind of nuts and bolts issues, managing stuff. Article 4 deals with how are the states going to interact. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, for example, we have reciprocity. If you go to a University of Wisconsin state school, meaning like Eau Claire, River Falls, you can pay Minnesota tuition prices. We do that so it's easier for our students. Now, that's not true for every state. We don't have reciprocity with every state. Article 5 deals with how to amend the Constitution or how to change it. Hey, if we don't like it, how do we fix it? Number 6 deals with the supremacy clause. And we mentioned that earlier, this idea of who's in charge. How do we know who has the last word? And we don't want it to be an individual. We want it to be something more consistent, something more stable, something that's not at the whim of voters. Article 7 deals with ratification. And ratification is the process of approving the Constitution, formal approval of the Constitution. Lastly, make sure that we're studying, making sure that we are ready for this test. You should understand how we ended up with a democracy, who influenced it from other countries, what documents are important, what documents we borrowed ideas from, and then how do we structure our government to maintain the principles that we want. Have a good night.